was what they called a decolonization of the academy. And they were arguing that dialogue is a liberal instrument of oppression. Democracy is something imported from the North, the global North. They wanted free education, and they wanted the workers in the university space, the cleaners, the security people, and so on, insourced, as they called it, because these workers were all employed by companies making money out of it, but the employees didn't have benefits and so on. We got involved because we were asked to come and mediate on specific campuses. We then became involved in a much broader, what was called National Education Crisis Forum. The crisis is past. There is a measure of peace on our campuses, but the underlying issues remain in place. We haven't managed to transform, both in terms of curriculum, but also in terms of the space. How is it possible that in 2015, the University of Cape Town, a traditionally white university under apartheid, had 95% of its full professors being white? That's an ongoing challenge for us. Another project we've been involved in is the Mandela Initiative on Poverty and Inequality. This was in collaboration with 14 universities, but also structures of the state and of civil society. I don't want to go into too much detail here, but some of the things that emerged were that our society, despite 25 years of democracy, is the most unequal society on earth. 1 in 4 of our 6-year-olds is stunted because of malnutrition. We mapped poverty right down to the ward level. And when you look at that map on a screen, it looks like nothing so much as an old apartheid map with the so-called homelands, the Baltistans. You can still see them. Those are the concentrations of poverty in our country. In other words, we haven't shifted the underlying patterns of privilege and wealth accumulation. Another project, this is an international project, the Mandela Dialogues on Memory Work. This started in 2013, went on for 4 years. It involved representatives from 16 countries, all troubled by the failures of transitional justice and looking for different ways of doing things. We had representatives from Canada, the United States. Jared Drake, who was here, was a participant. Some of you might know Michelle Caswell. What emerged for us that was most disturbing is a growing lack of confidence in democracy. And of course, that resonated with us in South Africa. A host of other questions were arising from that process. Like, is transitional justice really just a mechanism to rescue oppressive regimes for democracy, but not to allow radical transformation to happen? Are truth commissions just ways of smoothing an elite transition? A way of dealing with the past quickly and then moving on business as usual? Is democracy failing in the United States? That's what I was hearing from Laura yesterday. Did President Obama fail in his mission? Are human beings failing the Earth's other species? Has the government of Canada failed its Indigenous peoples? Do we need to begin thinking beyond democracy? I'll circle back to some of these questions, but just a few more minutes on the work that we're doing. That Mandela Initiative on Poverty and Equality translated into 2 continuing programs at the foundation. One is on land, and the other is on early childhood development. In 1994, Nelson Mandela promised South Africans that 30% of white-owned land would be transferred to black South Africans by the end of his presidency. Today, the estimates are that about 8% has been transferred. You will understand the anger, the frustration. As part of our land program, we've engaged with white agriculture, with government. This has to be done quickly. We also discovered that when we're talking about land, we're not only talking about agricultural land. Not all black South Africans want to become farmers. They want to have access. They want to own property. One of the startling statistics for me is that most of our cities have all these golf courses. Now, Cape Town has 34 golf courses in the city. They're owned by the local government. They're rented at very nominal fees to private clubs. But there's a terrible need for high-density housing for poor people. But poor people in Cape Town live in townships and informal settlements, miles out of the city. How's that possible 25 years into democracy? One other example, how land connects to early childhood development, is that our research has now shown that the great majority of our youngsters are not in creches or early childhood development centers. They're actually in detention centers because the people who run them don't qualify for government subsidies. And what we've discovered is you look at why they don't qualify. Well, one of the boxes they have to tick is that you have to have title deed to the property on which this creche is functioning. And the great majority of black South Africans don't have title deeds. How is it possible that that public policy hasn't been changed after all these years? When the widespread violence directed at people identified as foreigners started in 2008, we convened a process over 2.5 years. We went into 11 of the communities where most of this violence had taken place to try to understand what was going on. Now, of course, there are deep underlying causes, like we haven't reckoned with the past. People are angry. The levels of poverty and inequality and so on. But the factor that we felt was most significant is that in all these communities, there was no confidence in the state at all. In fact, parallel states had emerged. So people wouldn't go to the police for security. It would be the local strongman. You don't go to the Department of Housing to get a house, put your name on a list and wait forever. You use informal structures. And what we discovered is that the immigrant communities, and most of these communities come from elsewhere in Africa, have their own networks. And so you have a conflict between these informal structures and systems of authority. We started advocating for changes to be made back in 2010. So what's happening now in South Africa, it's not a surprise, it's not new. But what is surprising is that we haven't seen concerted action to address the underlying causes. Now, I could go on and on talking about our work, but I'll just wrap it with an archival story. The student leaders that we were dealing with during the campus rebellion were also saying to us that Nelson Mandela was a sellout. He made concessions, he made compromises during the negotiations before democracy, which condemned black South Africans to accepting their lot. So reconciliation, it has two meanings. In our case, in practice, it's meant reconcile yourselves to no transformation taking place. They're angry. How have we responded? We've invited them to come and engage with Nelson Mandela's personal archive. He kept notebooks throughout the negotiation process. Come and look at what he was dealing with. Come to your own conclusions based on the evidence. Laura was talking about evidence yesterday. The other thing we're doing is a longer-term project. We're working with a scholar called Follet Chair. And what he's doing is he's looking at the longer histories of the Eastern Cape, where Nelson Mandela was born. And what he's saying, especially to young South Africans, is if you think Nelson Mandela sold out in the 1990s, you need to see what the polities in the Eastern Cape were doing at the time of colonization and the ways in which they negotiated with British imperialism. And what he's highlighting is you can't decolonize in a meaningful way until you know very well the longer histories, the histories before colonization. And what he's argued in relation to Nelson Mandela is that he grew up in a family, he was part of the royal family, which had long traditions of negotiation with imperialism, of accommodation. Reckon with that, as well as what happened in the 1990s. That gives it a different perspective, a different way of engaging with oppressiveness or the experience of oppression. So how did we get to this place in South Africa, this difficult place? I believe that under Nelson Mandela's leadership, we started in 1994 with a very good strategy for reckoning with the past and for building a liberatory future. And that strategy had three elements to it. The first one was nation building. Find the shared narratives, the collective memories that can begin to create an inclusive space for us. The second element was put in place special instruments for restitution and reparation. So the Truth Commission was one, but there were any number of others. We had a land restitution process. It's kind of ground to a halt, a broader land reform program, Black economic empowerment program, employment equity, special pensions for those who contributed to the struggle, and I could go on listing. And the third element was to restructure the economy and redistribute wealth. I think we started quite well, but we lost our way. Nation building had a shadow. When you're trying to build a space of belonging, there will be those who don't belong. And I think what we're seeing in South Africa today, where people are being identified as you come from somewhere else, you don't belong here, is part of that shadow that we need to reckon with. All those special instruments, the implementation has been so poor. And in some cases, hasn't happened at all. Arguably, some of those instruments weren't appropriate. And we need to be critical of what Nelson Mandela's government put in place. I was in government throughout his presidency, and I have to concede that there was a kind of hubris. We thought South Africa was exceptional. We could do things no one else had done, and we could do it very quickly. And also there was what I think of now as a kind of, I think we were entranced by this need to be the best, and that the best comes from the north. So we were implementing models that came from the global north. If you take the education system, we inherit the apartheid education system in 1994. How do we transform it? Why did we not look at Zimbabwe? Or Mozambique? Or Brazil? Or Uruguay? What we did was to implement models from Canada and Australia. They weren't appropriate, they didn't work. And then restructuring the economy. We put a reconstruction and development program in place, which was premised on a redistribution of wealth. But very quickly, we dropped that and we embraced neoliberalism. And I believe we're paying a terrible price for that today. So those two questions, is democracy failing? Did Nelson Mandela fail? Well, I have kind of provisional answers. I would say that in South Africa, democracy is failing. And that Nelson Mandela will have failed if we don't do differently very quickly. The danger, though, is to think of South Africa as exceptional. I don't think the challenges we're facing are unique at all. From our experiences of international engagements, we're beginning to face up to the reality that democracy accommodates, if not fosters, structural violence. And it has enormous capacity to absorb individual and collective violence. So I'm trying to think about that in relation to Canada. From my vantage point, Canada has done remarkably well. But let me ask you a couple of questions. Would you agree with me that Canada accommodates the structural oppressiveness of an extractive and destructive capitalism? Does Canada accommodate the structural oppressiveness of imperialism? What about patriarchy? What about what Jacques Derrida calls global Latinization, the dominance of English? Is the oppressiveness of a dominant English a reality in Canada? What about human exceptionalism? Which means that other species, non-human species, can be exploited by us as we will. What about a dominant mode of knowledge construction we could call positivism? Bell Hooks calls it Western dualism. Helene Cixous calls it phallologocentrism, a mode of knowledge construction which is not hospitable to indigenous ways of knowing. That'd be fair to say. Of Canada? So I could go on. These are multiple intersecting structures that are oppressive. And each one is implicated in the others. And each one is fed by the others. Canada feels to me about as good as it gets. But would you agree with me that it's not good enough? I think that we're living in the end times. If we define end times as times in which humanity as we know it will end, if the catastrophe that we know could happen does happen. Arguably, we've been living in the end times since the beginning of the nuclear arms race. We've kind of stopped thinking about that very much, but the threat of that catastrophe is still very much with us. But now we're faced by climate catastrophe. And again, Laura was talking about evidence. I think the evidence is overwhelming that we're moving into a time of very rapid climate change, which is going to impact on humanity in ways that we can't imagine. That should focus our thinking, shouldn't it? It's a question for me because do you remember 2008, 2009 with the global economy in crisis? I was hoping at the time, well, this will force humanity to completely restructure the global economy and do differently. But what we saw was leaders patching it up, and then we carry on as normal. But it feels different to me now. I think the catastrophe that we're facing is something that will affect all of us. It won't only be the underclasses who go down, the elites who will go down as well. It won't only be countries of the global south, countries of Africa, South Africa going down. It will also be countries like Canada. Our challenge, I believe, is one of imagination. We have to do differently, and to do differently, we have to think differently. And what that will mean is that those who are powerful, those who are privileged, the ones who have a modicum of security and hope, will have to embrace loss. I want to quote one of my favorite writers, James Hillman. He wrote, "We can't change anything until we get some fresh ideas, until we begin to see things differently. Loss means losing what was. We want to change, but we don't want to lose. Without time for loss, we don't have time for soul. And arguably, we don't have time either for justice, or indeed for survival." The privileged, those of us who are privileged, will have to give up much of our privilege. And I'm not talking about the kind of Bill Gates philanthropy. There has to be a fundamental restructuring of human society, the way we live together, the way we organize, the way we share resources. To be honest with you, I don't have much hope. You know, I remember in the 1980s when things were at their worst during the struggles against apartheid. And, you know, there is a mythology that South Africa avoided a civil war and had a peaceful transition to democracy. Actually, we did have a civil war. And we had state terror on an unimaginable scale. 30,000 people died in political violence between 84 and 94. I remember in those years having no hope that it would change in my lifetime. And I remember my partner and I decided we're not having children, we can't bring a child into this world. Well, Nelson Mandela was released from prison, and we celebrated a bit too much, and we had a child. He's now 27, and I talked to he and his partner, and they talk about not having children, because the world we live in is not one you really want to bring children into. I actually have some nostalgia for those 1980s years. Terrible as they were, I knew who the enemy was. Today, I don't really know who the enemy is. Worse, I know that I'm implicated in all these structures of power and privilege, wealth accumulation. And back in those years, there was a wonderful solidarity, comradeship, in a noble struggle. But today, I find it very difficult to find it, even in the institution that I work at, the Nelson Mandela Foundation. It's difficult to find coherence and to understand how all the battles we're fighting actually link together. I don't think hope is very helpful, though, in any context. I think what we need is faith. Faith that continuing to fight for justice matters. Doing what we can do matters, irrespective of what the future will bring. There are many books about Nelson Mandela. And by the way, most of them are written by white people. And most of them are written by people who don't live in South Africa. Extraordinary reality. And you read these books and you have interpretations of what his life meant and what the lessons he offers are. I haven't discovered this fundamental one. This is what I learned from him. Is you've got to have faith. You've got to keep going. He talked a lot about his prison years, 27 and more years in prison, and talked about being nostalgic about the prison years, because he learned things that he wouldn't have learned in any other way. And one example of that, I remember in 2005 talking to him about patriarchy. And he said, when I went to prison, I was a male chauvinist. And when I came out, I believed in equal rights for women. And the question to him was, well, what happened in prison? And he said, well, I read a lot and I thought a lot. And I realized that my views were completely wrong. That I find inspiring, but it's long haul stuff. And that's what we're confronted by now. I'm going to end off there and hope we can engage in a conversation. Thank you.
So I will join you for handling questions, comments, thoughts, words. I'll take anything.
Just to say, a lot of people I talk to about these kinds of questions respond to me by saying, it's not democracy that's failing, it's people who are failing. If democracy was properly implemented. But I think we've had, a couple of centuries of democracy. Surely we have to be asking the question, maybe there's something structural about democracy. And if we don't reimagine it, then maybe we need to think beyond it.
Yes.
I don't really know enough to challenge you on some of these things. But I noticed you didn't mention the government that came after Mandela. Once he was no longer in power, once he no longer had the ability to make decisions. I forget his name, but Jacob something.
Thabo Mbeki and then Jacob Zuma.
He was notorious for his corruption and his attitude. So why do you not put some of this on to him and then go to follow him down?
Well, Nelson Mandela was implicated in the appointment of Jacob Zuma as deputy president of the ANC. And if we talk about a corrupted leadership, corrupted political elite, a corrupted private sector, I think what we have to reckon with is that as apartheid began to come to an end, and it became clear that the ANC, the liberation movement, would become the next government, what we saw happening was a seduction by capital of leadership, liberation movement leadership, including Jacob Zuma. But also, we didn't have a revolution. It was a negotiated settlement. And so the new government inherited a bureaucracy, as it was. Not a single bureaucrat lost their jobs. Now, apartheid was a deeply corrupt system. And those systems of corruption, those patterns, those networks continued and grew. You can't understand Jacob Zuma unless you understand those realities. So it's not enough to blame individual leaders. We all have to take responsibility for what happened.
Just a general comment, but is it democracy that's failing, or is a big part of the problem that the power of capitalism? That creates situations where those who have the power want to keep the power, of course. And then, but the other aspect I want to throw in there is, like I think so much, and you look around what's happening even here or in the States or anywhere else, and is part of the problem, where people were progressives asked the question, why do the non-progressives, why is there such backlash from the right or whatever part of the spectrum you want, from the extremes? Like, what allows that to take place? Or is it because, I've begun to think that it's part of the problem because progressives, for progressives, if we feel, and I consider myself a progressive, maybe not as good as I should be or whatever, but it's part of the problem that it's so obvious to us that this is progressive or this is right by your definition, and then we don't pass that. We think it's so obvious that, well, why does it have to be explained? Why does it have to be taught to children? Some years ago, Jane Jacobs wrote a book called Dark Age Ahead, and she was talking about, one of the examples she used was, well, she used a whole bunch, but one of them was when China turned inward in the 1500s or something. China turned inward, and the emperor basically said, destroy all the ships, we are not dealing with the outside world. We are going to keep our, be very insular. And because of that, China lost its lead as far as like an ocean-going nation, and European nations started to rise up and so on. Another example that she used was parents have to teach their children the things to pass, the knowledge to pass on, or it's not automatic, right? We have to teach them. But somehow I think progressives, I think that's part of it, is that for us, for so many progressives, I think, if you feel that, well, it's obvious, why does it have to be explained? I think that's part of this.
Sure. Those are both questions without answers, really.
Yeah.
I mean, capitalism, I don't think you can disentangle from democracy. You can at one level. But democracy is deeply implicated in capitalism.
Right, democracy.
Democracy is deeply implicated in capitalism. So I don't think it's an option to say, well, capitalism is the problem.
Oh, it's not by itself.
Yeah, they're all intertwined, progressive enough. Yeah, I also wrestle with that question myself. And we have in our organization a nascent civic education program, and it's premised precisely on that. We need to do far more about teaching young people, but also learning from young people about progressiveness. But I think we need far more dramatic interventions now. I mean, we need to be doing that long haul work, which is arguably intergenerational work, but we also need far more dramatic interventions. And I don't know what they are.
Yes?
Thank you for your talk. Can I ask you a question about these 3 steps, kind of reimagining and bringing new coalescence to citizenry, like the first one being nation building? It seems like incredibly important, and I kind of wonder about that part of the process and how, I want to say rebranded it without the cynicism about it, but how kind of a new story was told and that had buy-in. Because a lot of times, you know, for years and years, like the story that's being told is in every school, in every radio station, and it's also very much put your finger on where the story starts and where it ends, and where to transform it, and it seems like a great challenge.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. You know, at one level, that project had to do with big symbolic gestures, like, you know, a new national anthem and a new flag, so, and 11 official languages. But it had to be bedded in deep transformative work for it to succeed. And I think one of our big failures has been precisely in the area of language. How can you begin to build shared narratives if English is so dominant that the other languages have to fight for space? It's something, you know, we're holding up a mirror to ourselves at the Nelson Mandela Foundation. You'll be glad to hear this. Is that you can be in a meeting with 10 people who all can speak 3 or 4 languages, but the meeting will be conducted in English because there's one white person in the room. And so now we've implemented a new language policy for the organization, which is you will learn a black language so that black languages can have space in official business. We didn't do that in government. And yes, it's tough and it's a longish road, but the fact is we didn't even try. Beyond sort of translating annual reports into 3 or 4 languages for a couple of years and then that stopped. But there were no programs to enable public servants to develop proficiency in other languages and ensure that those languages were working in the organization. To me, that's fundamental to nation building, right?
Can I have a follow-up?
Of course.
Sometimes fascinating stories come up from the archive which mirror a kind of aspiration to the future, something that happened in the past that you can then call to as a move to inspire the future. Have you encountered any of those kind of moments or something that was unearthed from the archive and say, there, I don't know, not to normalize sort of relationships, but to say, there have been moments in the history of success in this kind of build, you know, like to build off of the historical precedents. Well, Well, then it's just a comment that there is a, but that's an interesting case study. You can use the archive in that way.
Yeah, I like the question because behind it is another question. Why do we study history? Well, it's not in order to learn lessons from the mistakes of the past, because I don't think human beings really do learn from the past. But maybe it's about being inspired.
You learn about these cases in the section.
Yeah. Well, one just recently at the foundation, you know, we're involved in a legal battle right now where white right-wingers fly that old apartheid flag. You know, they go to a rugby game and then but it's all over social media and so on, and it's deeply offensive to black South Africans, but to all South Africans who fought against apartheid. And so we brought an application to the Equality Court to have displays of the old flag declared to be a form of hate speech. And well, we won that. But we're now embroiled in an appeal and so on. But in terms of the archive and the inspiring stories, so we're confronted in public debates, mainly by white Afrikaners, who say, but Nelson Mandela would never approve of what you do. You know, he embraced the old Springbok emblem of the rugby team. Remember that emblematic moment in 1995? And I was trawling the archive, developing ways of countering this argument. And I found the transcripts of Nelson Mandela's evidence in a court case in 1997. So 2 years after that World Cup, he took the South African Rugby Board to court because of its lack of transformation. Now that's not a story the right-wingers want to hear, but it's a story from the archive that inspires us in the work that we're doing today. It's not either or, you know. You need, through those gestures of generosity, create the space for transformation to take place. But if the transformation doesn't happen, then you need to take other means. I know that's not really the answer you want.
No.
Yes?
I was just going to make a comment that I'm not sure it was the democracy or capitalism that is the problem. It's the inequality that has developed over the past 10 or 15, 20 years due to the government policies, or it possibly could be globalization, or these meetings, these G8 or G7 meetings that they have, that these policies are creating an enormous inequality in societies. And it's eventually something is a gift, because if people can't afford to rent an apartment, you know, and provide for the basics of life, something's got to give, because the whole economy will just shut down. If nobody's spending money, it'll just completely shut down.
Have any of you read the work of Thomas Piketty? He's a French economist. He wrote a very fat book called Capital in the 21st Century. Again, archival research, he's looked at inequality since the late 1700s, globally. And what he shows is how levels of inequality, obviously uneven, different parts of the world, but dropped dramatically after the Second World War. And that had a lot to do with the imprint of socialism, if we're honest. So you see a dip, but then from the early 1980s, and it's just kept going like this since then, and that has a lot to do with neoliberalism. Sadly, Thomas Piketty has no answer to the question of how do we change that. But I think we're caught in a global system that, what you've just said, it's strangling the underclasses. Nelson Mandela in the 90s, if he sold out, it had to do with him confronting that reality and deciding, well, we have to accommodate it. We can't fight this.
And I think one of the problems is that the human race is too adaptable. If they weren't so adaptable to, high rents and getting through, and they would be upright, they would be, rising up to fight against it.
Yeah. Revolution. Although the track record of revolutions hasn't been very good, has it?
Yes.
One of the things, we keep circling back to neoliberalism, one of the things in the strike, you mentioned the sense of division solidarity right now, like there was 30 years ago. And to some degree, I do feel that that's a factor, that's an element of neoliberalism, the emphasis on individual responsibility that comes about. But how do you start counteracting that? Because I don't see how any of these very large, fairly fraught and intersected issues are going to be even approached for those people coming together. That's not really a fair question to ask.
No, it's a very good question. And many of you read work by Dean Spade. So, looking at civil society in the United States and the extent to which it has been corporatized. Now, when I read that work, I realized, but this is exactly what's happening in South Africa, is you have these blue chip NGOs sucking up most of the funding. And we're one of them. What we actually need to build the kind of solidarity you're talking about is community-based organizations to be well-resourced and directly accountable to constituencies. Because if you take an NGO like ours, we're not accountable to any community. We're accountable to funders. Some of them are corporates. And I think, for me, that's a challenge, is how do we resist that kind of corporatization of civil society? Because, we point fingers at the private sector all the time. But when we need their resources, we take them. But also we absorb their values and their ways of doing things. Yeah, I don't have a simple answer. One has an idea of where we need to be, but how to get there. And that same pattern, I don't know if you see this in Canada, but we see it in South Africa, certainly, is if you look at the museum and archives world, exactly the same kinds of processes. All the money is being soaked up by these flagship projects, Robben Island Museum, Freedom Park, Nelson Mandela Foundation. And very little resourcing is going to community-based initiatives, community-based memory work, which arguably is crucial in the South African context to reckoning with our past and to finding healing for people who are still wounded by what happened in those years. We've got it very wrong. You know, so it wasn't only about accommodating neoliberalism at a kind of macroeconomic level. We actually absorbed their values. The system's values. So that even when it comes to archives and museums, that's how we work.
We're talking about lots of really big things like capitalism and everything, and I would argue that NGOs and nonprofits basically are private sector. But I guess I'm wondering, what do you view the role of the archivist in these end times, in these difficult times? Like, maybe like, I would like to know what you think, like, but narrow it down. Like, what do you think the role in South Africa or here or anywhere?
Sure, I was hoping to avoid any sort of specifically archival questions. Well, in my view, the work of archive is justice. And that, for me, works at the micro level, is in the space that you work in. What are the voices that are being excluded? What are the voices that are very difficult to hear? To me, it's the call of justice, to listen carefully for those voices and to create spaces for them. But at the macro level, well, I don't see the point of running a beautiful archive like Fisher Library when everything is, folding around you. Is that surely the work of archive has to be about mobilizing archive to be a dynamic public resource for continuing struggles for justice. Now that might be difficult to translate into practice in particular instances, but that surely has to be the vision.
Yeah, totally agree.
Okay.
Yes.
I just wanted to return to one of the earlier questions that you posed to the audience. So the idea of, has Canada failed its Indigenous peoples? I just want to push back on the use of the possessive. And the example that you gave of the researcher looking at the long tail history with Mandela and the Eastern Cape, could we not rephrase the question, has Canada failed its treaty obligations to sovereign nations? And how does South Africa, would you have insight from your perspective on how Canada can, as an entity or archivist in the room, address that from a treaty, as treaty holders who have not lived up to the treaty? So,
Yeah, I take your point completely. Yeah, I think it's always important to use descriptors that are about self-identification. In the South African context, the public debate amongst progressive people has been very much about when land has been taken and a century has passed, and in our case, not a single treaty. Who do you return the land to? Who does that land belong to? And what we're wrestling with now is the challenges about sharing that, right? Is South Africa belongs to all who live in it. I think, I don't know enough about the Canadian context, but it seems to me almost to be a cop-out to reduce it to a question of treaties, and were those treaties not signed in conditions where these were not equal partners negotiating?
I think treaties is very fraught territory, but I feel like there's really fresh, there's really interesting spaces where seven people can think about, and it is absolutely a question of land, the idea of resources and reciprocity, and there's probably people in the room that can speak better to this question than me, but
the idea of where can we meet as individuals and communities to reach our treaty, our responsibilities as settlers and people in these spaces. I feel like there's lots of parallels in South Africa, because absolutely there's the question of, well, I live on this land, but I didn't appropriate it, or I came later, or my grandparents were like that. There's lots of fruitful and deeply uncomfortable conversations that I feel could be had.
Do people self-identify as settlers still today? Here?
I feel like that's a more recent development, particularly in progressive communities, to start self-identifying.
Yeah. It's one of the learnings for white South Africans, is that whatever your specific personal and family histories are, you were a beneficiary of apartheid and colonialism. And you still are, and your children will be too. And that means you carry a responsibility, and you need to live a certain humility.
A responsibility to whom?
To those you've benefited off and continue to benefit off. And that's forever shifting, of course. But those private clubs that enjoy the golf courses in Cape Town, isn't the imperative is to take your golf course 30 kilometers out of town? You can afford to drive up there and become involved in developing, not all of it, you want some green space, high density housing for poor people, become part of building that new society. Time for beer.
Well, I actually was thinking that very thought, and I was thinking that you've given us so much to talk about as we drink. But I do think, obviously, once again, an amazing talk and so much to think about. So I would like to ask you all to join me. I would also say that if there is hope, I believe it is with the young. I think it's interesting that the revolution that took place in South Africa was again at the university. And I don't know how it is, but there is, thank God, we have young university students in this world. As if there's a hope. I believe it. So, that in childhood.
Yes.
Thank you.